Right. That's okay. Yeah, I can see.
Yes.
Thank you very much for the invitation. This is a topic that I wanted to talk about because it's something I'm increasingly getting concerned about as a factor that's making it very difficult for science to work effectively. The fact that editors are not being adequately scrutinized. And before I go any further, I want to thank a number of colleagues, in fact, more than is on this list, but in particular, these are fellow what we mainly would call sleuths, people who work on really mainly detecting fraudulent activities. René Aquarius, Maria de los Angeles Oviedo Garcia, Mark Hansen, Pablo Gomez Barriero, Guillaume Cabernac, Shaba Shabo, and Nick Wise. And we're a wonderfully international group, as you can see. But these are all people whose activities have really influenced my thinking on this topic. Sorry, just trying to advance the slides. Yeah. I think I missed one. Yeah. So what mainly got me interested in the topic of editors was the phenomenon of paper mills, which I'm guessing most of this audience would know about. Essentially, in the past, when fraud happened in science, it tended to be individuals or perhaps two people working together. And then really about 10 years ago, I think, started up this tendency for groups of people to almost operate businesses selling authorship and citations and similar things to people and getting articles that were often fraudulent and certainly very low quality into journals. And people started to really notice this in a big way around 2021, 2022. And places like Nature started putting out pieces like this one talking about the fight against these fake paper factories. Institute of Physics Publishing had to retract about 500 paper mill papers in one go. I think that was down largely to Nick Wise. And then in 2023, more than 10,000 research papers were retracted. In the scheme of things, of course, this is a tiny percentage of all the papers published, but it was such a dramatic increase that it started to suggest some serious problems were going on. And most of these were focused, in fact, in the publisher Hindawi, which was subsequently disbanded by Wiley, its parent company, because they had become untenable because they had been so infested with paper mills. And the big publishers started to get quite worried about this, and they have formed a group called United to Act, which is a growing international movement which is trying to take action against the phenomenon of paper mills, because they say it's a threat to the integrity of the scholarly record, and they need collective action rather than each trying to solve this problem on their own. Now, I think in principle this is a good idea. But I'm quite critical of perhaps what they're missing out here, because what they're focusing on is trying to develop strategies in 5 areas. They're trying to educate people about paper mills. They're trying to do more in the way of corrections post-publication if they find paper mill content. They're trying to find out more about how paper mills operate. They're doing research on paper mills. Developing trust markers. They're putting a lot of money into developing AI systems that might be able to identify paper mill products before they even get out to reviewers. And they're trying to make sure that people have dialogue so that they share information. And this is all very good, except if you notice how editors are mentioned here, the first is that editors need to be educated. And the second is that you need to be able to verify their identity. I would say that the problem is really that in order for paper mills to flourish, it implies that there are editors who are corrupt and who are letting stuff in. And no amount of education is going to actually help that. And verifying identities, I think, is important. That's one goal I would go along with. But overall, my sense is that in trying to grapple with paper mills, the publishers and people getting together to try and solve this problem are not placing enough attention on the key role of editors, who are ultimately the gatekeepers of what a journal publishes and doesn't publish. So that if they get corrupted, the journal can very quickly get contaminated because they're letting stuff in that shouldn't be published. And it's vital that they deal with this very promptly. And I think this is not currently happening. In terms of the question of corruption, Shaba Sabo had a lot of fun with a paper mill that tried to actually corrupt him, but it's quite instructive how it worked. So he has written, earlier this year, he published a book called Unreliable, which is all about bias and fraud in biomedicine. And I can thoroughly recommend it as a very interesting read from an insider as to what are the factors driving poor science. But presumably unaware of this publication by him, he got a paper mill writing to him, offering him payment for placing papers in in journals that he edited. And most of us, if we get this sort of email, would get pretty cross, but probably just delete it or respond angrily. But he, being him, played along and thought it'd be quite interesting to see if he could find out more about how this sort of thing operates by, in effect, running a sting operation. And you can read about it in more detail on the For Better Science blog, which I thoroughly recommend that. Ultimately, he was sort of sending back emails saying, well, I'd like to help you, but what exactly would I need to do? And do I get money? And when he started going into it more deeply, he was sent this chart that you probably can't read the details of it, but it basically said, well, depending on the nature of his involvement, and it's a bit unclear to me quite what the distinction is, but I think for one, he might even be an author. For the other, he might just sort of let things in. I'm not sure. But there were these two levels of cooperation. And then the payment depended on the impact factor of the journal. And it could be as much as $24,000 for ensuring a paper was published in a journal with an impact factor of 16 or over. So you begin to see that when editors, the temptations for impoverished, hardworking editors to get corrupted are quite strong. And there have been other exposés of this kind of thing. It certainly is happening. So editors need to be looked at carefully to make sure that they are not corrupt. I'm going to just give you two examples of two case studies, and it's quite difficult to pick just two from a larger collection I have, which really demonstrate the nature of the problem that we currently have. And the first one is an MDPI journal called Logistics, which just published arrant nonsense and didn't really, to my mind, take sufficient action against this. The other was in Scientific Reports, which most people regard as a reasonably prestigious outlet from Springer Nature, where, again, they were publishing gobbledygook. And in that case, there has been, as far as I can tell, some action taken, although they're not very transparent about it. But let me just show you the sort of thing that is going on. Case one. So this was what I call the tomatoes paper. And I blogged about it, and you can read again in more detail if you want the full gory details. But essentially, the story behind this was that it was initially picked up by something called the problematic paper screener, which was developed by Guillaume Cabanac and his colleagues to automate screening articles that might be using devices to avoid plagiarism check being positive. And the way they were doing that was to take synonyms for words in the paper, substitute synonyms to hide the degree of plagiarism. This is a very dangerous strategy because if you're dealing with technical language, it can end up with some unintentionally hilarious consequences. But in this case, they were picked up by the problematic paper screener, this particular paper, because they had tortured phrases. So instead of talking about fuzzy logic, they talked about fluffy logic. Unsupervised machine learning was unaided ML, and so on and so forth. And further reading showed that this was the least of the problems of this article. It had some pretty incomprehensible text. And at the end of the day, you can actually follow the entire denouement of this, if you look at PubPeer and you check for this particular article, and there's a whole series of comments from different people about as a more and more peculiar things emerged about this paper, but an anonymous commentator found that the reason it read so strangely was that it had started with an article on livestock and fish, but livestock was changed to tomatoes and fish were changed to cruciferous vegetables. And so this ended up including these remarkably unintelligible paragraphs, like talking about a creation framework devoted to developing homegrown creatures brought up in rural settings to create vegetables. This can bring domesticated tomatoes likewise to broad or serious frameworks. Broad frameworks include creatures wandering meadows, ordinarily under the oversight of a herder. Differently, serious tomatoes are situated in shut foundations and are outfitted with ICT innovation, which empowers creatures to be observed continuously inside. I think this is something to do with free range versus factory farm cattle, but it doesn't quite work with tomatoes. And so it goes on. I mean, it's clearly nonsense. And, any editor that accepted this is clearly not doing their job or is just letting stuff in. It was peer reviewed, and one of the positive things about MDPI is that it does often publish the peer reviews, and often the reviewers are named. So I was able to check on this and found that there were 3 reviewers, all with long track records of either being editors or peer reviewers for MDPI, but none of them seemed to notice that this paper made no sense. The first reviewer was very concerned about the use of first-person language and the punctuation in the paper. The authors robustly responded and said that it was perfectly okay to use first-person language, which I agreed with, only that the rest of the paper didn't make any sense. Reviewer 2 focused on the structure of the article and again didn't talk about the content at all. And reviewer 3 tried to give a synopsis of the article, which is impossible to do because it doesn't make any sense. And also said that the figures should be reviewed and the dimensions are variable and that moderate English changes are required. This sort of vacuous, generic sort of thing that you get from fake reviews. But the fact that all 3 of these reviewers had track records reviewing and editing for MDPI was really worrying, because they clearly were all in on some sort of scam to let through completely meaningless garbage. Eventually, when I say eventually, actually, this was a pretty fast retraction, and it was in part because they were very embarrassed that I featured this on a blog, and it got a lot of negative attention for MDPI. And so rather unusually for them, they retracted it. Oh, and I should say that you can see here that the editor was also somebody who was at the same time as publishing in this journal Logistics, was editing a special issue of an MDPI journal called Mathematics and was soliciting papers for that. So there seem to be major problems here, and I contacted the MDPI research integrity people about it, and as I say, they retracted it. But I then wrote again and said, well, what about the edit? What are you going to do about the editor and the reviewers? And this is their reply. We are adopting an educational approach. This implies sending notifications to the reviewers and the editor to inform them of the retraction and to clarify their responsibilities in the review process and outline the potential consequences of a superficial review, etc. And we take proactive steps to offer additional guidance and resources, so on and so forth. I mean, they basically just don't get it. Or if they do get it, they don't care. Because, there's no way any of these people should be anywhere near gatekeeping the scientific literature. But there they are, still there. So to my mind, you can actually get legal threats if you describe MDPI as a predatory publisher. So I won't call them that, which some people do, but I would say they are certainly a negligent open access publisher, or what you might call a NOPE. They really, are not taking their responsibilities seriously enough. And I'm aware that they do publish some good stuff and some serious people publish there, but it's quite clear that they are not taking this sort of thing seriously at all. And they're just either unaware or incapable of doing anything about it, or, genuinely just happy to have this sort of stuff in their journals. Let's turn to case two, because case two involves a publisher that's never been really regarded as predatory, Springer Nature, and Scientific Reports, which is a sort of mega journal, which they started up, Springer Nature started up, and it's a lot of people are quite happy to get papers in there, thinking, you know, it's not a bad sort of outlet. But in October last year, a group of us were concerned enough to write an open letter to their head of research integrity, Chris Graff, about a similar sort of case where it was clear that very, you know, implausible and impossible stuff was getting published in the journal. It was precipitated, in fact, by an author correction, which Guillaume Cabanac, on a Slack channel that we have for sleuths, he sort of went ballistic when this happened and said, you know, look, they've corrected this. And you might think, well, isn't it good to correct something? And the trouble is, it's not good to correct something that's full of tortured phrases. If you just change the tortured phrases back to what they should have been, you're really just, it's just, Ian Hussey said to me, it's like fishing a fly out of your soup and thinking all is well with your soup. You know, you've got evidence that there's something seriously wrong. And so what they had were these tortured phrases, lots of weird synonyms for Parkinson's disease, but then the random forest classifier became the backward classifier. The random forest was the irregular backwards, and the area under the curve was the region under the bend. And sometimes people say, well, couldn't this just be because these people didn't have English as a first language? But the thing is, this is not the sort of error you get from not having English as a first language, because these are not phrases that are routinely translated and back translated. They are stock scientific phrases that exist as they are. And they're a big red flag for a paper mill product, particularly if you get a lot of them in an article. So I thought, well, you know, if that was the case, we should be able to see other bad things in this paper. And sure enough, it does get a lot worse. So Guillaume complained, and a lot of the other sleuths looked at the paper, and all of us found something. I mean, I found a string of spurious citations. Nick Wise found that the literature review seemed to have been paraphrased from the reference text. It really didn't read like a literature review. It was very weird. They also had a very weird and incomprehensible figure that bore no relation to the text. It was a diagram of something, but it wasn't possible to tell what it was a diagram of until Nick Wise found that it actually came from a plagiarized paper that was about a completely different topic. So you see these sorts of things in these paper mill products sometimes, these sort of figures that just make no sense in the context. And that's because they've been just lifted from another paper. And then another anonymous reviewer just found there were very inconsistent numbers in a table. So, I mean, this was clearly complete and utter junk. And again, the question is, how did this ever get accepted? There has to be something wrong with the editor that accepted that, and indeed with the reviewers. But the editor is the gatekeeper who should have spotted it. Now, unlike MDPI, Springer Nature and Scientific Reports don't tell you who the editor was. So they know, obviously, and they in theory could do something about it. But the fact that this is getting into a journal like Scientific Reports, I would regard as the canary in the coal mine, that there's something seriously wrong. And so I thought it might be quite interesting to look at the editors of Scientific Reports to see if any of them are sort of well-known suspects. And I was astounded to find that there are 13,000 editors at Scientific Reports. This is one journal, it's a mega journal, but 13,000 editors, which didn't make it easy to search them. I did, though, with assistance from Brandon Stell from PubPeer, who did the last seminar here. I could sort of match them up against PubPeer and see whether any of these editors had actually had negative comments about their own work on PubPeer. I found 28 who had, and I think that's just the low-hanging fruit, to be honest. And these were 28. I wasn't counting just just having a comment on PubPeer. You had to be evidence that they had been involved in paper mills or in outright data manipulation or fraud. Pretty serious, heavy evidence, typically across more than one publication. And some of them were names that were known to the sleuth community as fraudsters. So you have getting into editorial positions in a journal like this, people who are probably placed there by a paper mill and who may look quite credible in terms of their CV and their publications and so on. But if those publications are all paper milled papers, you've got a big problem. So I'm pleased to say I meant to check it again before this talk, but at least in June, when I last checked this, all but 6 of those editors were no longer listed on the editorial board. It wasn't done in a transparent way. Springer Nature don't really like to communicate with me about this, other than to send a message. They did reply to the open letter and say that they were investing a huge amount in research integrity and taking on a great army of research integrity officers and so on. So, my view is, though, that what they should be doing is using open peer review, making it clear which editors handled which paper, which what MDPI does, and they hadn't picked up on those suggestions. And I suspect they're not scrutinizing their incoming editors quite carefully enough. So the big name publishers are all affected by this sort of activity. Wiley, not just the Hindawi bit of it, but Wiley more generally, MDPI, Springer Nature, Elsevier, and others. You can find the paper millers. There's a lot of different paper mills. It's an incredibly lucrative business. So they're trying all the time. They're like a virus trying to attack the entire publishing system. And there are steps being taken by the publishers to deal with it. As I've said, they try to raise awareness. They try to do training. They have mass retractions. They develop these screening systems. They're trying to develop criteria to detect these things, and they have this United to Act exercise now. But I feel they're not seriously enough about editors and about the difficulty you can have if you get a bad editor. So that's my main message, if you take away nothing else, that we need to be more serious about who gets to be an editor. So what do I think you should do instead? I think that editors, for a start, should be screened before they get appointed. And one way of screening is to actually check whether they have been flagged up on PubPeer in their own work as problematic, or indeed as editors for in other places. That won't catch. I mean, most people who are fraudulent are not picked up on PubPeer, but if you are picked up on PubPeer for what looks like fraud, that's a good reason for not having you as an editor. And then if you have an editor who accepted papers such as these 2 I've flagged up here, you should be looking very hard, not just at them, but also at any other articles that they have accepted, because it's likely that they're letting in stuff from paper mill sources, and you may find that there's a whole load of stuff that they've let through into your journal that should be retracted. They should be immediately banned, as far as I'm concerned, if they're accepting these obvious gobbledygook papers. And then I've said, include the name and the ORCID ID of academic editors alongside accepted papers, so that there's some transparency about who is responsible. And where possible, open peer review is extremely useful for helping you identify all sorts of shenanigans that go on, including rings of reviewers, coercive citations, superficial peer review. And there's a lot of that now coming out in a lot of the literature. So I think these are things that you can do, but I think the real problem is that the reason we have this difficulty is it's just not sustainable. It's a systemic problem with the structure of the academic world now. So this is a very nice paper that made a big splash in 2024 on the strain in scientific publishing, which was a big bibliometric analysis of the publishing scene between 2013 and 2022, showing the growth in publications. And just look at that figure for MDPI in particular. Frontiers is not far behind. They both were sort of trundling along at publishing, maybe a few hundred papers a year for pretty constantly, and then suddenly went zooming up in the past 10 years or so, 9 or 10 years, to the point that MDPI is now publishing about 250,000. And you can just see why this is happening. It's because if you multiply 250,000 by the typical APC, article processing charge, that they charge, which I think $1,600 is actually a low estimate of what they charge. It varies journal to journal, but that's £400 million in 2022 that they made, whereas previously it would have been a fraction of that sum. So the sort of conflict of interest for these open access publishers is huge, and they are all pushing to have publish more and more and more. Again, another example is with with Hindawi, which, as I say, I put rest in peace. They're now gone, thank heavens. But again, you could see the similar trend with Hindawi, with this rapid increase, sort of, exponential increase in the case of this journal, Computation, Intelligence and Neuroscience. And again, you can just multiply those numbers by the article processing charges and see this is just from one journal alone. Hindawi made over 8 million in 2022, and then this is just 4 of their journals that I've got here, which were particularly noticeable for these increases. Whereas and they actually were having more and more journals and more of them in the format of special issues, which is the vehicle that these publishers will use, because they've actually found that they think you can have infinite growth, and they take the view that everybody wants to publish something. Let every flower bloom. Everybody should be allowed to publish something. We don't want to be too restrictive. But the problem is that if you're going to operate a journal, you have to have editors as gatekeepers, and there aren't enough people to be good editors if you're going to grow at this sort of rate. An editor, in theory, is somebody with expertise and experience and well networked to find reviewers and so on. These people don't exist. So the great discovery was that you could start saying to your readership, would you like to edit a special issue? And then you can be a guest editor. You don't really need to be an editor with editorial experience or anything. And then you can find your own reviewers, and you can have your special issue on a topic to interest you. And this was a sort of, open invitation to the paper millers to say, oh, yes, we'd love to do a special issue. And then to sort of just let one of their guys in as an editor and let through all kinds of stuff. And I mean, in a sense, they were just too greedy with Hindawi, because they were letting in such preposterous material, often of no relationship to the subject of the special issue, that they got caught out, if you like. But I think the paper mills are getting cleverer. We're seeing less really obvious nonsense, and that's in part because they can use AI and they can use templates of what are good papers, where they just change a few of the details. And basically, it's getting harder and harder to spot this stuff. And I think it's a real crisis that's going to really, the whole system's going to implode if we don't find a way out of it. But meanwhile, the publishers, I mean, these are businesses, and businesses go for growth. And they seem to be unrealistic, though, in sort of seeing how much growth is really feasible year on year in an industry like academic publishing. There just isn't that much good material that needs to be published. And so what they're ending up publishing is stuff that should never be published. But they don't see that, and they see growth as the goal. This is just Springer Nature's annual report. MDPI don't do one. They don't give you their profits and things. They don't have a financial report. I was quite interested to see. But they're all making a lot of money out of this, and they don't seem to realize that this is doomed as an enterprise. It's a bit like, if somebody who was selling champagne said, well, we think everybody should drink champagne for breakfast, and so let's make more and more and more. And you run out of vineyards, you run out of quality produce to do this with, and your name gets trashed. But it's very like that. This is just another one. This is Wiley. They've got key growth strategies, publish more peer-reviewed research, develop new open access journals and volume-based revenue streams, high growth and emerging research markets. They just want to grow and grow, because this for them is money for jam, because they don't have to pay for the development of the product. We all sit and write our papers for them, and they just take the money and run. So this is a rather depressing talk, I'm afraid, but as you can see, I feel quite passionate about it, in part because I'm old enough to remember the days before all of this, when I was a journal editor, and like we we would process a couple of papers a week, and we would carefully select reviewers who knew something about the area. I would read every paper that I was going to accept because I wanted to be sure that anything I accepted was really not problematic in any way. I mean, those days are, well, I'm saying they're not totally gone. I think there are still journals that operate that way. But in this brave new world, we have a system where the editor really, in many cases with these mega journals, is not really doing very much other than just rubber stamping whatever two peer reviewers say. And if you've got corrupt peer reviewers, they're not even noticing it. So is there a solution? I mean, I think the solution may be in the hands of the funders and possibly academic institutions who should just refuse to allow people to publish in journals that don't have evidence of real quality control, and refuse to pay for journals that don't have real evidence for quality control. In the past, really both the funders and the institutions have almost run scared of the big publishers and allowed themselves to be pushed around, and I'm not entirely sure why. In part, it may be because a lot of researchers themselves are very addicted to this notion of publishing in high impact factor journals and don't want to see them disappear because it's, it's the way they get ahead in their career. So I think, academics ourselves are partly responsible for this state of affairs because we could have adopted different publishing systems that are not so vulnerable in this way. But I liked this paper by Timmis, which is in a microbial biotechnology journal, a rather obscure place, but they are suggesting that there should be really much more stringent standards in terms of what we as an academic community accept from publishers, so that they can't just run around saying, oh yes, we're massively increasing our integrity officers. They would need to actually show that they did not, if you did an audit of their publications, that they were not including rampant paper mill products. So that's my suggestion for how to improve the world, but I wanted to leave time for questions, and so I will finish there and say thank you very much for listening. And I should probably stop sharing.
Thank you, Dorothy, for your presentation. We will now take questions from the audience. So I will read these questions that were written in the chat. If you have more questions, you can keep writing them. We will end the session at 5 p.m. So we will have approximately 23 minutes. So I will start with the first question from Denis. With the increasing writing quality of AI, it will become increasingly difficult to detect fake articles. For example, the awkward or tortured sentences will probably no longer be present. Moreover, the use of AI is not necessarily synonymous with a paper mill. AI can also be used simply to improve English. Therefore, how can editors reliably distinguish between fake and genuine articles? Would editors be able, notably in terms of time it will require, to carry out this screening? Is there any reason not to be pessimistic?
No, we should be totally pessimistic. I mean, if I had the answer to that, I think, I could have the publishers paying me vast sums of money to advise them on this, because that is the question they are all asking, is how can we, overcome AI? Because it's I think the tortured phrases phase of this was rather short-lived. It's a rather simplified, automated process for trying to change papers. But now people will just press a button and produce a paper. And they're also talking about using AI for peer review. So I see that a system whereby the AI writes the papers and the AI peer reviews the papers, and there's no need for any academics anymore at all. So I'm very pessimistic. And I think what worries me is that I think we're going to go back to a system where you only trust the people you know. And in a sense, the move to open access and such like was motivated by thoroughly laudable ideas about democratization and getting away from the idea of it's just, who you know, and you only rate the people in science who you've seen at a conference or something. And that other people should be allowed to participate. And I think that now it's getting to the point where people are going to not trust stuff if it's not somebody, if it's not from a particular journal that is known to have high standards. And so a lot of people are going to be just automatically disregarded again, which we've almost come full circle. But it's a real unintended consequence of trying to sort of be more open to a wider community of scholars.
Yeah.
Depressing.
Quite depressing. Yeah. Another question from Francois. Would screening for fake papers coming out of a paper mill be easier if all papers had to be on open access repositories like Archive, bioRxiv, before submission? The argument being that sleuths could more likely find the issue in the preprint beforehand.
Oh, sleuths are overworked and not just underpaid, they're not paid. So poor old sleuths. I mean, I think if you wanted to have sleuth screening staff, you would have to pay for it. Somebody would have to pay for it because that is also unsustainable. I mean, the average when I retired, I thought I was going to retire, and then I got into fraud busting, and I then quickly realized it's sort of like endless. I mean, it's like a tsunami of stuff coming at you, and the stuff that sleuths pick up is a tiny proportion of the stuff that needs to be identified. Also, I was involved in a exercise a couple of weeks ago with PCI which had got rather infested by strange material being deposited there, and they decided that stuff should be screened. And there certainly was paper mill type stuff getting in, because there's even less that, there's no real critique of depositing stuff on an archive, other than, I mean, there are a few moderators are supposed to pick up on a few very obvious signs of things that they don't want to put on an archive. But in general, I think in theory, it would mean that people could look at it in advance, but I don't think people would. I mean, that's the difficulty. We're short of sleuths, we're short of peer reviewers. It's extremely hard to find people to peer review papers. And I think all of this is the consequence of this, vast explosion in the amount of material that people are trying to publish. So I think we just have to change a lot of structural things, including rewarding people for publishing lots of stuff, or making it a criterion for getting advancement in your job and so on, but to focus again on quality rather than quantity, so that the motivation for people to do this is less.
Another question from Patricia. Do you agree that all editors and reviewers working for big publishers should be paid for their work?
Depends. I mean, there are journals that have paid reviewers, but for whom it's a full-time job. I mean, Nature and Science do that. But that's a rather different style of reviewer from a reviewer who themselves is at the same time doing an active academic job. I know there are people who definitely think reviewers should be paid. And James Heathers has made a case for that and argued very strongly in favor of it. I've always thought, well, when I was, again, I'm perhaps just too old, I always took the view that reviewing was part of the job I was paid to do as an academic. It was, one of those things that you did in order to keep abreast of the field and to pay something back, because you were expecting people to review your papers. So I'm not sure that bringing money into it is actually going to help, because I think also, I mean, if you brought money into it, I think the corrupt people would be even keener to do it, because they would then get the money. So I'm not sure that money is the solution.
Another question from Raphael. What are for you the main priority actions to train the new generation of ethical editors?
Sorry, can you just say that again?
What are for you the main priority actions to train the new generation of editors?
I think to me, it's less about training the editors than selecting the right people to be the editors, because I mean, clearly they need to be trained to be aware of paper mills, and certainly in the past you would typically assume that a paper submitted to a journal was genuine and honest, and it wouldn't really cross your mind that it would be fraudulent. So now I think people have to be alert to the possibility of fraud, and I guess that's one way in which you could train them. But I see the higher priority as taking very seriously the role of editor, and also moving away from a scenario where they're just confronted by this vast amount of material that they haven't got time to think about or process or do anything serious with. So I think for me, part of the problem is more that, it's just this volume of stuff, a lot of people getting to be editors who should not be editors in the first place because they don't have the skills to do that job. And they're just therefore really treating it like a vote of referees, for example, rather than using their own judgment, often in areas that they don't even know a lot about anyway. So, I mean, I think this is the problem with the rise of the mega journal.
Mhm. Another question from Diana, legal question. Journals sign up and declare they are in favor of scientific integrity. Clearly, many are simply lying. So, can they be sued?
Who by? And under what have they actually? I think the question is, what law would you get them under, really? I think there are people are getting sufficiently angry to start thinking they should do that. And I think there's certainly been an attempt to bring a class action against publishers then what were the three things? One was that they should be paying referees, and the other is that they shouldn't. This was a year or two ago. Somebody brought in this action that somebody else here might know more about this, but one was that they should pay referees because they were benefiting from free labor, and the other was that that they shouldn't prevent you submitting to several journals at the same time. I cannot remember what the third one was, but I thought this was not the case I would bring. I mean, I thought I would bring a class action against them, possibly for the reasons that the questioner suggested, that they are not doing the job that they, in a sense, promised you to do. I think that would be an interesting case. But the case that has been brought, I thought would never win, but apparently the publishers are really scared about it, partly because the firm that's taken it on is one that has been quite successful with class actions in the past. So that will be quite interesting. I mean, it is getting to the point where I think a number of people want to sort of turn around and say, look, we've put our trust in you to look after this side of academia, and you've claimed that you're doing it, but you're not. So it's an interesting idea, but I think once you bring the law in, you really need to have evidence that they have in some sense broken some sort of law. And I think they'd be wealthy enough to employ very clever lawyers that would argue against that. That would be my guess.
Okay. A question from Isabel. Is there any risk that one unintended consequence of publish, review, curate model may be to increase paper mill's activity? What good practices would you recommend to avoid this?
Yeah, the publish, review, curate model only works with very strong gatekeeping, I think. And where it has worked, it's tended to be a publisher who will only accept papers. For example, Wellcome Trusts have that model with Wellcome Open Research, but it's for Wellcome funded researchers. And there's no guarantee that they're all honest, but to get a Wellcome grant, you have to jump through a lot of hoops and demonstrate that you're a serious person. So you couldn't get paper millers in that system because they wouldn't be funded. They wouldn't have the correct funding credentials. And I know European Open Research, is that their journal? What it's called? The ERC have got one. The main problem, though, with that model is that it's just not very popular with authors. They just don't like it because it doesn't have the prestige of the more traditional journals. So I think this is where I think the academic community themselves are partly responsible for the current system, is that they are very reluctant to give up the prestige of publishing in a high impact journal, and attempts to introduce these other models doesn't work. If you were going to have publish, what was it, the order of things, publish, curate, review, without any gatekeeping, it would be a fiasco. And in fact, I think there are some attempts to do that have been a fiasco. I think I was looking at papers in Chaos, QUEIOS, which I think was set up with the best of intentions for that sort of model. And it's full of, junk, basically, unfortunately.
A question from Margot. I'm guessing that these fraud articles cannot be cited, being improper material because of the tortured phrases. So why is it so interesting for authors to agree for paper mills to produce these articles for them?
Because there's a number of potential benefits to having an article, even if it's full of rubbish. Um, One is that there are still a lot of places where people just count your publications and don't read them. And you can certainly get around that. And I think the UK is relatively good in that most of our top institutions and funders don't count publications. They can see that's just not much use because it doesn't get anything about quality. So they will say, if you're going to be evaluated, give us your 5, 6 best publications. And that puts you on the spot because you have to have publications that stand alone and are strong. So that's one way around that. But there are other things I discover more and more about how publications are a currency. They're a currency if you want to get a visa to the United States. There's certain sorts of visa for academics where you just have to have publications. And indeed, you can also use your history of peer review. Now, the people judging the visa are not going to read those papers. They're just going to say, oh, look, you've got a paper and, you've got 5 papers. You have to have a certain number, and then you're clearly a credible researcher. So and I fear that quite a few of the people who engage in paper mills may be people who are trying to escape an oppressive regime somewhere. Whether going to the United States is a good idea at these current times is another matter. But you're trying to get a visa. And if the visa requirements include, that you can get one if you have published, this to you is you're not interested in the science at all, but this is a currency that will get you out of a bad situation, and one can feel some sympathy for these people. So it's just the way having publications is a currency. It completely breaks down if the people making the judgments look at the content, but in many circumstances they don't. And so you can get away with it, and you can get promoted to quite high levels in certain countries that don't really read the publications. You find people who've been paper millers who have only got paper milled publications who then get into high senior positions, and then it's a disaster because you've got a corrupt person at the top of an institution who's going to spread corruption through the institution.
Oh, that sounds terrible.
It is.
I'm looking for another question. There's one from Michelle. What should I do as a reviewer when the article's quality is very low, not necessarily paper mill article? The other reviewers' comments are superficial, and the editor who contacted me has accepted the article against my recommendations.
Ooh, that's an interesting one. I mean, I think most people would not do anything. I don't even know if I would do anything. I might write if there's an editor above the editor, if there's an editor in chief, if I was really concerned, I think I would write to the editor in chief and say, look, this is concerning. And I think there are instances of this having happened, actually. MDPI has had instances of reviewers in exactly that situation who have been sufficiently concerned that they've complained to somebody in the institution above, but typically it doesn't get them very far, and they just get dropped. I mean, somebody who was an editor-in-chief, not an editor-in-chief, an editor of a journal, an MDPI journal, I know, who resigned because this sort of thing was happening, and they seemed to be powerless to stop it. So it will depend, I suppose, on the publisher and the journal, whether you can get any traction. But I think you have to have very hard evidence. I mean, the notion of superficial reviews is interesting because we're seeing more and more of these. It might be 2 or 3 lines saying, this is a very good paper, it should be published. Well, maybe it is and maybe it should, but it's not what you would normally think of as a review. It doesn't demonstrate engagement with the content. But yeah, I mean, I think that's really difficult. I think I would probably, now I'm old and crusty and trying to put the world to rights, I probably would try and get either the integrity officer of the publisher, or if there was a more senior editor who would listen, at least inform them that I think this is not satisfactory.
A question from Severin. There are public or non-profit scientific publishers. Perhaps it would be better to publish with this type of publisher, which is not profit-driven.
Yeah, I mean, to me, in my area now, if I try to publish, I will go try and go to what I would call an old-fashioned journal, and there's increasingly few of them, but many society journals are not for profit, and that the people who are the editors are well regarded people in the field, and you tend to know what you're going to get there. You're going to get traditional serious editing. So I think you should think hard about where you publish, but it's very, very tempting. And I know a lot of people who are under pressure because of the system to get some publications out will think, well, something like MDPI is nice because it's easy. And, as I said at the outset, honest people publish perfectly decent work there. And you can send it to them. It will get turned around in a couple of weeks. You'll probably get very superficial reviews, but, do you care? Then your paper is published. So the temptation to do that, if you're under pressure to produce publications, is really very strong. I think in the long run, it's not a good strategy because, people, I think the word gets out that that's so easy to publish that, you probably haven't been well evaluated. But I guess if you have been well evaluated and you agree to release the reviews, that's some protection.
Another question from Francois. Could there be a way to flag obviously bad papers so that if one editor sees the issue, all others would have the same information?
Yeah, I mean the publishers, this is part of their what's it called? Action to act. No, anyway, their action plan about paper mills, United to Act, is to share more information. The principal limitation there is actually legal. That they get worried again. A lot of the time, publishers are quite worried that people might sue them if there's any suggestion of defamation. But I think there are ways around that if they're willing. And part of the problem has been that this is often just used as a sort of hand-wavy excuse for not doing anything.
A question from Thomas. Many research institutes don't want to make a list of acceptable journals because it would be against the freedom of researchers. What do you think of this argument?
Yeah, I've never had a list of acceptable journals in my career in any of the places I've worked, but I've had there's a sort of intrinsic list that you work with that, you're aware that some journals are well regarded. It doesn't necessarily correlate with the impact factor, interestingly enough. I mean, in psychology, I know in general, the APA journals were well regarded and they tended to be traditional. American Psychological Association, this is for those who are not psychologists, but they tended to be traditional journals in the sense of having a sort of eminent editor and a squad of action editors working with them who were also sort of well-regarded people in the field, and you got proper, sensible expert review. And I think people were quite surprised when league tables of impact factors came out that sometimes they weren't terribly high for some of the APA journals, but they were always, you were pleased to get your article in that journal because it was known to be a sort of proper, solid scientific source. So I guess I'm not really answering the question. I don't think it's a good idea to have a list of acceptable journals because the question is then how would you evaluate that and who would decide what it is. But I would say look carefully and talk to senior colleagues about what sort of journals. It's almost a question of what to avoid, but also which to go for, and try and go for ones where the editor, I think, as you gather from today's talk, to me, the editor is very, very important, and have an editor that is a known person in the field who you feel will do a competent job.
All right, we have 2 more minutes of questions, and there are 13 more comments or questions. Let's see. There's a question from Raphael. Accountability of the different actors in the system could be an essential lever for change. There's no accountability without transparency. So yes, indicating the name of the editors and articles seems like an easy win. Is there strong resistance there?
I don't think there is, but I mean, after the open letters of Springer Nature, I actually met with, I know Chris Graff slightly, and I met with him and we had a coffee and I sort of said, well, what about this? And he's sort of a bit you feel it's not going to happen. He's a very nice, friendly man, and he doesn't sort of just say no, but you feel that but it doesn't really give a reason for it not happening. I think maybe they're worried that people will get up in arms and or people may be less willing to be editors if they feel that they may get in trouble if then they happen to accept something that turns out to not be very good. I don't know. I mean, it's traditional that it's not stated, I guess, and so it's just people are going with the flow. There's much more resistance about open peer review because people have said in the past this is, potentially bad for the peer reviewer. They may get, if they were to reject somebody's paper and it was somebody powerful, it could be bad for them. In practice, you can have open peer review with an anonymous peer reviewer, which is I think, acceptable. But also, in my experience, if you write a really good peer review and the rest of the world can read it, that's it. That's in your favor. And indeed, some places like Wellcome Open Research give a DOI to the peer review so it can be cited, and sometimes it makes a real contribution in its own right. So I think this idea of, making that, I'm digressing though from the question, but I think that the reluctance about these things is not entirely clear. And that's one way in which maybe through something like United to Act, where the publishers do claim to be listening and interested in taking the views of the general public, maybe they could be pushed on that.
Thank you. So we still have some questions, I guess, but I don't know. Would you like to stop there?
I can carry on if you can carry on, but
Yeah.
up to one.
Yeah, I'm trying to sort between comments and questions. Not always easy. Do you have any thoughts on the communication between the journals? I've been asked to review the same manuscript twice. Both times I found the data very suspicious and rejected it. How can we make sure that it is not sent to a third journal where it is accepted?
I think it's almost impossible. Yeah, and this again comes down to the publisher. If it's different publishers, I mean, they are in competition and they don't really particularly want to communicate with each other. I think the paper mill phenomenon and the rise of fraud has made them more willing to do so. And I think some of them may be talking about there may be other people in this webinar who know more about this than I do. I think some of them are talking about maybe setting up some sort of communication whereby they can sort of like warn each other of this sort of thing. I mean, it's a terrible waste of people's time as well, repeatedly, reviewing things, but people will just keep going on and on and on until they find somewhere that will accept it.
Another question from Patricia. Do you have any evidence to say that university presses are taking better care of research integrity? Would they be a place to go as an author?
Well, I think they're not. There certainly are instances where journals published by university presses have had big problems. I think they're probably not as bad. I don't know. We would need to. I think one would need to have more systematic data, and it may be that these guys who did the strain paper, I don't think they looked at university presses because they're relatively small compared to Elsevier, Wiley, Taylor and Francis, and so on. So the answer is I don't completely know, but I think in principle that should be the case, that they're not so driven by the growth and the profit motive and so on, and that therefore they should be a bit more immune to this sort of thing. But certainly, I ran a meeting in April that was we had a small contribution to funding it from Oxford University Press, and I thought very favourably about Oxford University Press, and then some of the other sleuths said, no, terrible things happening at Oxford University Press. Yeah.
Cleantis is asking, what about the NOP journals, so the NOAP journals that have occasional special issues put together by excellent researchers? Some of these are high quality. I've just been approached to edit one such issues, but I'm worried about MDPI for obvious reasons.
Yeah. I mean, this certainly happens, but I mean, I would just avoid MDPI like the plague myself. And if I wanted to do a special issue, I would go, I might put the suggestion to another publisher that I trusted better or to a journal that I trusted better. But I mean, they have a very good, efficient operation. They will process everything very rapidly. They will take over a lot of the hard work for you because that's their model, is to make everything easy, because they want people to submit there because it all flows through the system very easily. And there's no question that there are some good special issues that come out, but the idea of a special issue has become now so tarnished because such a lot of them have been taken over by bad actors, that I think you might find that your hard work in editing a special issue is, rather contaminated by the sort of bad odor around that whole idea of an MDPI special issue or a special issue. And I mean, they have different terms for them, but I think a lot of these publishers who are just stacking up huge, who've had this very rapid growth curve, the reputation is not good of the work that comes out of them. And so you may, just as, people get an unfair advantage for publishing in a high impact journal because you're judged by the company you keep, there's this sort of like this reverse effect where you can actually be damaged by the company you keep, even if your paper is absolutely fine. So that is just unfortunate.
And a question from Ruben. There's some trend to publish signed reviews in the name of openness, but shouldn't we also be worried that such openness will contribute to a favor exchange system of friendly reviewers in subdisciplines where everyone knows everyone? For instance, you scratch my back, I scratch yours.
I think that certainly can happen, but my guess is that if the reviews are open, then people will see if the review is fair and reasonable, or if it is superficial, or if it overlooks major problems with the paper. So I think that's perhaps less of a problem. But I mean, we know there are cabals of reviewers who, for example, make sure that one another's papers get cited. So there's coercive citation rings that go on. So, I mean, the trouble is human beings are very ingenious at doing things for their own advantage. And if they're not motivated by doing good science, and people who are not motivated by doing good science are encouraged into the system, that's when we start having problems.
Thank you very much, Dorothy. I think we've run out of questions,
Good.
so it's time to end the session. Thanks everyone for attending the webinar and for your questions. Thanks again, Dorothy, for your presentation and the nice discussion and all your answers to our many questions. Before you leave, please mark on your agenda that the next PCI webinar will take place on December 1st, and the speaker will be